If you're thinking about buying a home here in Kansas City in 2025, you've probably noticed something very strange happening with the market. Some homes are gone in a weekend, others are taking 90 plus days, cutting the price several times and still sitting on the market. Rates don't look like they're going anywhere anytime soon, and prices are correcting in some areas of the metro, but also increasing in others. In this video, we're going to break down the massive shift happening in the Kansas City real estate market and why it'll have such a big impact on anybody thinking about buying a home in 2025. Part number one is the confusion, and there are three key variables you have to know about in order to avoid overpaying for a property, buying in the wrong location, and ultimately finding the right one that checks all of your boxes before other people jump on it first. The first variable you have to know is that we're not quite in a buyer's market, but we're also not in a strong seller's market either. I'll put this table on the screen that kind of breaks down what you can expect in both. In a buyer's market, we start seeing a lot of price drops, properties sitting on the market a little bit longer, etc. In a seller's market, which is more typical of what we saw over the last couple of years, that's where you see the bidding wars, people going over asking, the homes disappearing in as little as a weekend. The truth here in Kansas City is that we used to be a very strong seller's market. In some parts of the metro, that's still the case, but it's much more fragmented today than just last year or a couple years ago. We're going to break down this data that you're seeing on the screen. There's a massive divide based on the county, the suburb, even specific neighborhoods that you might be looking to purchase a home in. That's what we're going to break down in part number two. The second variable is home prices. I'm starting to see a lot of talk across the internet, the news, social media, etc., about how home values across the country should start declining over the next year or two. A big example of this was Zillow, who recently came out for the first time in years projecting a decrease in home values over the next 12 months. The problem is real estate is entirely local, and we're almost starting to see the opposite happen in Kansas City. For example, if you take a look at this article from Resi Club, it mentions 60 markets across the United States where they project home prices will decrease. If you look at the top of the list, a whopping negative 10% swing in some cities in Florida, Texas, you'll see some in Arizona, etc. The major difference is that on this list, you won't find many cities in the Midwest. A lot of these markets saw a ton of demand as people were relocating from the coasts where housing prices are much more expensive. And they saw huge increases in prices over the last several years. But what we're starting to see here in Kansas City isn't quite a crash. It's not necessarily a correction across the board. It's much more like home price increases are starting to slow down, but it all depends on the specific area. The third major variable has to do with mortgage rates. Another one where over the last several years, all the experts, they were projecting that rates would fall down to around the lower 6%, the 5.5%, and we are still not there yet. If you look at this article from Housing Wire, it says that although mortgage rates haven't come down significantly, lenders are reporting increased demand. Rates are unlikely to change very much. In the short term, two other factors are likely to influence rates. One is Trump's deal with China to lower tariffs for 90 days could provide interim relief to home builders as tariffs on construction materials were estimated to add as much as $22,000 to the cost of building a home. It says that the second is inflation data, which rose about 2.3% year over year. And although that's the lowest annualized increase since February 2021, market observers think tariffs could ignite inflation gains in May. These factors are dampening hopes of a Fed rate cut in the near future. And that hesitancy, that lack of a concrete signal that rates will start going down, that's why a lot of home buyers across the country, a lot in Kansas City, have decided to just bite the bullet. They're tired of waiting. They're going to get on with their life and make the move. It's all reflected by that data. But the point of these three different variables is the Kansas City market is very different from what's happening in other markets across the country. It's certainly not crashing, but it is starting to fragment based on location. Understanding exactly how that's happening is absolutely critical to avoid overpaying for the wrong property and spotting the right one when it does pop up. And that's exactly what we're going to break down in part number two, which is the big divide. But before we jump into the numbers, if we haven't met yet, then welcome to the channel. My name's Nick. I'm a licensed real estate agent here in Kansas and Missouri, and I firmly believe, especially in this market, the best properties, they're not just going to people willing to pay the most, willing to get into bidding wars, waive critical protections like inspections, appraisals, etc. They're going to the home buyers who spot value before everybody else in the market does. And I'd love to make sure that that is you. So if you're in the market to buy a home here in Kansas City, not currently working with an agent, and if you'd like to have a conversation about how to make use of all of this, make it all specific to the price point, area of town, and type of home you're looking for, feel free to give me a phone call, text message, email. Love to make it happen for you. The big divide that we're seeing across the metro actually falls along state line. On the Kansas side, we see homes that are priced higher but selling faster on average. On the Missouri side, north of the river, south of the river, we're seeing homes that are priced a little bit lower than Johnson County, but also taking longer to sell. And if you look at general data from places like Zillow, it gets even more confusing because Zillow says in Johnson County, it takes about 3 days for the properties to sell. It says on the Missouri side in Clay County, north of the river, it takes around 5 days, and in Jackson County, it's saying around 9 days. However, that data is entirely misleading, and what we're actually starting to see is two completely different market dynamics unfold altogether. We're going to start on the Kansas side, and then we'll go to the Missouri side. This data, it shows some of the top Kansas City suburbs in Johnson County, Kansas. These are the ones that a lot of viewers of the channel reach out about, so that's why they're included. You've got the median days to sell. And then you've got the average days to sell. You'll notice a huge difference between those two columns. That's going to come into play here in a second. In short, what that difference is the median. It includes most properties. It excludes extreme outliers. The average accounts for some of those properties taking much, much longer to sell for. So you can see in places like DeSoto, Spring Hill, Fairway, the time between when a property is listed, when it goes under contract, on balance, in most cases, is between 11 to 19 days. But for the rest of those suburbs on the list, we're looking between 3 and 6 days, which is very, very fast. And that speed at which properties are going under contract creates emotional urgency, where, especially if you're in the market, you're in the early stage of the home search, and you get around to the point where you've seen enough properties to where you're ready to pull the trigger and make an offer on one, what we're starting to see is this positive feedback loop, where these quick listings, they trigger really quick offers because you've already been through the cycle before, and that builds this cycle of competition, which is exactly what we're seeing in the prices. So this second chart, the same suburbs, I left the days to sell, the median days to sell column on there. Then you can still see a split. Aside from Leawood up to DeSoto, where properties are selling under the original asking price, you can see all of the suburbs like Mission all the way down to Shawnee that are actually selling at or above the asking price. But even on the Kansas side, even in these Johnson County suburbs, it's not like they're all going above the asking price. It's not like they're all going in a matter of days. You're starting to see some very big splits. That's going to come into play here in just a second. But something very different is happening on the Missouri side. I'll put that data on the screen right here. In this one, we've included Kansas City, Missouri, Blue Springs, Liberty, Parkville, Smithville, and Lee Summit. The median days to sell, it's between 12 to 17 days versus like the 3 to 6 we saw in some of those Johnson County suburbs. You can see the average, there's a slightly bigger gap here compared to the Johnson County suburbs. What this means is you get much more time to look at some of these options. It doesn't necessarily mean that none of these properties are going under contract in one weekend. It doesn't necessarily mean that none of these are seeing bidding wars, offers, etc. We just had a client that purchased a home in Liberty and actually closed just a week ago, but when they went under contract on it, there were multiple other offers. It went in one weekend, and we kind of knew that was going to be the case getting into it. So there are certainly outliers no matter which side of state line you're looking at. But this second chart that shows the percent of asking price received, so did it sell for above or below what they originally listed the property at, you can see in every single one of these, on average, it's between 96, so 4% off of the purchase price, and then the highest is what? Somewhere in the 98.5%. So most of these properties are going under the list price. That doesn't mean all of them. Again, still some bidding wars depending on the specific listing, but in most cases, they're going under the asking price. So essentially, the story behind this data is that on the Missouri side, in some of these suburbs, these properties are listed on the market. 1 week goes by, a second week goes by. They're getting feedback from all of the buyers who came through, but nobody's pulled the trigger in most instances yet. As a result, a lot of the sellers are deciding to either cut the price hold firm or cut it several times. And when the offer does come in, the buyers have a little bit more room to negotiate. But this isn't necessarily the case in all of Missouri, and it's not like in all of Kansas. The properties are just going very quickly and all selling over the asking price. Because in this market, it's much less about the area, the price point, and much more about each specific listing. In other words, each property that comes on the market is its own separate equation. That leads us to part number 3, which is perception versus reality. In a fragmented market like this, the psychology, how well a home is priced, how it's positioned, etc., plays a much bigger role than what we used to see over the last year or 2 years, etc. Just because a property sells very quickly doesn't necessarily mean it offers the most value. Oftentimes what's happening there is they've deliberately underpriced it to get as many people in as possible. That's what causes the bidding war and the price to go over asking. But the inverse is also true. Just because a property has been on the market for a very long time doesn't necessarily mean it offers less value, especially when you factor in the room to negotiate. And this is what we brought up, the difference between the median days to sell and the average. We mentioned it in the previous section of the video, and that's what comes into play right here. So if you look at the Johnson County chart again, you can see, the median days to sell, it's anywhere between 3 to 6 for most of those suburbs. But the average is anywhere from 17 to 29 days. And essentially what this boils down to is 2 things to keep in mind. One is that the listing photos, how the property looks online, it is emotional bait. We've all been in a situation where it looks phenomenal online. You have to get in and see it. And then you go to see the property in real life and it's just like a completely different story. The inverse is also true. A lot of the properties that many people are overlooking, they might not have the best photos or have the most attractive price or have the best updates, features, etc. inside of them. But when you go see them in person, that's when you start to see the real value. I think the second one is ignore the listing price. The listing price is always just a starting point. Even the homes that have been on the market that are overpriced, you never really know when a seller is willing to entertain a much lower offer. I'm not saying lowball, but a lower offer than their listing price, or if they're already talking about making another price drop. So any questions buying a home in the Kansas City suburbs? If you're not working with a real estate agent yet, but you want to take advantage of everything that we discussed in this video, find the properties with real value that most buyers are overlooking in this market and sidestep bidding wars so you never have to compete in the first place. I'd love to make it happen for you, so feel free, give me a phone call, text message, email. We'll set you up for success. Before you go, if you're not ready to reach out yet, this video, it breaks down everything you need to know about how to navigate this market and so much more. So click right there and I'll see you on the other side.